You're such a good guy.
All right. We have a lot to get through today, so we will go ahead and make a start here. Both to bless our gathering and help us get through all this material, when we start with a word of prayer. God, we give you thanks for beautiful weather today, the reminder that spring is on its way and that the celebration of Easter is just around the corner. So we invite you into our time to guide our conversations and help us see the word that you have for each of us in the passages that we study today. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Amen. Okay, so before we get into the assigned readings for today, one of the questions or discussions that came up in the last session had to do with languages and what language may be spoken and how the different tribal groups and so forth, how that might have worked. So I found an article about languages linked to Abraham, which I think will suffice for what we're looking for. So there were several of them that came up. So the first was Akkadian, which was the primary language of the Mesopotamian region, which would have included which is where Abraham came from. And that would have been the primary language spoken in that area around 2000 BC, which is roughly the time that Abraham was coming up. So very likely Akkadian would have been his mother tongue, for lack of a better expression. So he moves then 75 years later to Canaan and that region. And so in that region at that time, there would have been some local West Semitic dialects. The article didn't say what language they would be dialects of, so I don't know if this also would be the influence of Akkadian or not, but there would have been specific Canaanite and Amorite dialects that would have been spoken in those areas. Both of those dialects are among the streams that would eventually come together to form ancient Hebrew. So there's some similarities between those. Abraham had extended family in Haran, Laban, from last week. Obviously that's where Laban was based. And in Haran they would have spoken Aramaic. So likely the whole episode we had last week with Jacob and Leah and Rachel and Laban and all that, they likely would have spoken Aramaic. And then it's possible that having grown up in he may have been familiar with Sumerian as well. Sumerian was also spoken in the Mesopotamian region, although about that time that Abraham would have been coming of age, Akkadian had kind of replaced it. But there likely were people that spoke that. It also had a note in there saying that some religious interpretations suggest that Abraham spoke Hebrew, probably trying to make that connection even stronger. But most of the contemporary historical and linguistic analysis places the emergence of Hebrew as a distinct language sometime around the 10th century BCE, so about 1,000 years after Abraham, although I guess he lived for 17% of that time or whatever. So anyway, but very likely would have postdated really any of the stories in Genesis. So, crash course in ancient Near Eastern language.
And did they say whether any of those were written?
Oh, if they were written? I don't know. You just asked about spoken, I didn't do the written word.
Go too far, John.
Yeah, Sumerian stuff they've got.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, they would have
Go to
been,
the museum with it, but
I mean, there are depictions, every time there's a description here of, raising a stone or a marker or a monolith to mark something. I mean, not all of those would have been inscribed necessarily, but we do know that historically, a lot of those, what do they call them? Stelas? A lot of those, were used. For example, there was, last week, Laban and Jacob have their truce, and they mark it with the stone and the pile of rocks, and it kind of creates a boundary line. And so a lot of those would have then been marked as to what the significance of them was. So if it was the result of a treaty, if it was the result of a boundary dispute, a marker of a military victory, whatever it might be, there would have been some sort of writing on them. So, we can assume they had some form of something that they used for that. So in our section today, 35 to 38, I've been mentioning what we see in the lectionary from these sections as we go through them. And the only passage in these 4 chapters that's in the lectionary is chapter 37, verses 1 through 28, and really is Joseph's origin story, if you will, when they throw him in the well and sell him off into slavery. We might decide as we read the other sections why they may not have been included in the lectionary. Yeah. So if we pick up in chapter 35, which is page 38, so remember, we're coming immediately off of the account of, they've just massacred all these people in Shechem because of the rape and kidnapping of Dinah, and all of the sort of ambiguity that came out of that. And so immediately, so basically this chapter is kind of a collection of a few different stories and tidbits about Jacob that comes after his disastrous inaction following the rape of Dinah. So first we see there's a physical move to go back to Bethel. Probably they weren't super popular in the Shechem area, would be my guess. And so it was a good time to move. So there's a couple of just interesting notes in that section. He tells his household, this is in verse 2, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, purify yourselves, change your clothes, and then we're going up to Bethel. And then a little bit later, they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. So the foreign gods could be a reference to the gods that Rachel had, as it's still not clear that Jacob knew or knows anything about those. We would presume that others in their entourage, their servants and their field hands and whoever it is traveling with them, likely probably had their own foreign gods that they brought with them. And historically it's been proven that, especially at that time, that earrings would have often been fashioned in the likeness of your particular favorite god. So that's why he asks for their earrings, that they also served sort of as an idolatrous representation of that. And then in verse 5, then they set out, and the terror of God fell on all the towns around them, so that no one pursued them. So again, this is one of those expressions
Well,
that,
most of the men were still probably still a bit uncomfortable.
well, that's, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's one of those ambiguous terms that only shows up here. You don't find it at other places in the Old Testament to kind of get more of a contextual. So, yeah, was it fear of what had happened to Shechem, that people left him alone? Was it, was God actively keeping people away from them? It's hard to tell exactly what the sense of that verse is. So then, interestingly enough, after that episode, God reappears to Jacob, and I'll make sure I didn't skip anything. God reappears to Jacob, seems to have a very similar conversation that they had a couple chapters ago about the change of the name. And basically confirms the Abrahamic blessing that it extends to Jacob. My guess would be this is another example of two different sets of editorial work coming in and addressing that. And then we see Jacob set up another stone pillar to mark that place, and he calls it Bethel again, which he'd already done previously years ago when he had the dream at Bethel. So some of that seems kind of a duplication of the earlier story. Okay. So the next bit is Rachel is pregnant again, and she dies in childbirth, giving birth to, well,
Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's hard to look at that and not see that. But then interestingly, Jacob renames him. So I don't remember if this came up last time or not, but that typically at least in the biblical narrative, it was most often the woman who named the child. And I think if you go back and look at those stories of Leah and Rachel and their competition to have children, it's often Leah called him, whatever, and is naming the child. So this is one of the few exceptions biblically where a child is born and the man or
Very small
husband.
print at the bottom, it maybe explains what it's about, why. It gives the meanings.
Yes, yeah,
One's about the disastrous birth, the other one's about,
yes.
but maybe that's what he's thinking he's going to become.
Well, it could be,
Yeah.
it could be. Yeah, there definitely is meaning in those various names. So Rachel's died, buried her on the way to Bethlehem, and one of the travelogue comments in here that you can go see the tomb today, according to the text. So I don't think that's a known location, but anyway, just a way again of showing that this is being written not contemporaneously, that it's looking back at those stories.
Do we know when it was written?
No, well, I mean, no, I don't think there's a good, and I think it depends on which of those four traditions is editing or writing this particular part, because they were hundreds of years apart, so. Okay, and then there's a verse 22. While Israel was living in that region, so that's a rare example where they're calling Jacob Israel. While Israel was living in that region, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine Bilhah, and Israel heard of it.
It's very strange, because nothing ever happened, is it?
Well, that's it. That's it. So
Just throw it in there.
it seems like an odd it seems like an odd detail, but there's a couple possibilities for why that shows up in there. The Talmud, which is ancient set of Jewish writings, sort of explaining and extrapolating on the laws. The Talmud sees this as an attempt to defile the slave girl of his mother's dead rival. So he's Leah's son, and this is Rachel's servant, whom Rachel has given to Jacob, whether they're married, whether he had multiple wives, or it says concubine. So, but the thought is that in doing that, legally then, he kind of defiles her, and she becomes sexually taboo to Jacob. So it's like a vengeful sort of thing, maybe.
Why would he do that to his dad?
I'm not sure everyone in this family has really good relationships with each other.
Between the wives and the concubines here, because they all seem to, the children that are born seem to be treated, just they're all in the same list.
Well, we'll come to that in a little bit.
That was coming out, yeah.
We'll cover that in a different story, but that'll come back up.
As long as you've got sons, it doesn't matter who had them.
That's
I never understand
The more
how
the
the
merrier.
fundamentalists deal with all this.
Yeah, you said that as well.
so the other thing to think about is that in the biblical world, cohabitation with the consort of a ruler is a way of making claim to his authority. So later on, we talked last time about the rape of David's daughter, Tamar. It's all going to get much more confusing by the end of this, trust me. But and that was by Absalom. But Absalom also sleeps with several of David's concubines and does it as a power move. That he's, or at least it's symbolically in that way. So this could be an attempt by Reuben to seize, basically during his father's life, his firstborn's right to be head of the clan. So, I mean, you see that in the prodigal son story, right? I mean, that's unusual because he requests his inheritance while the father is still alive. We know that as the firstborn, he's out of luck in this family because it doesn't work that way. But we will also see in a bit when we get back to the Jacob story that Reuben does seem to kind of have some seniority among the brothers.
But also, he's the good son. He's the one who doesn't want to upset his dad and kill Joseph, which is a bit at odds with this bit of it.
Well, yeah.
So, I mean, sexual disease must have been rampant in there.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, they seem to live to an old age regardless.
Yeah, there seems to be quite a bit of it going on, doesn't there? Yes. Yeah.
But it didn't stop it, I'm sure.
Yeah,
This is almost like sort of wild animals now,
Yeah.
a new lion turns up and displaces the previous head of the
Yeah.
what do you call it, pride.
yeah, yeah. So anyway, so all this is going on, and at the end of that chapter, is the death of Isaac, 180 years old.
Presumably he's been doing all this travelling around as well. So.
Yeah. And the only comment I'll make on that is it is interesting that in that last line, Esau is listed first, even though Jacob has subverted all of the birthrights and blessings and is the by law and tradition would be the more important one. So anyway,
Isaac hasn't been travelling around, has he? Because it says Jacob came home to his father.
well that's right.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
right.
sorry.
Yes, yes, thank you, good point. All right. So chapter 36 is primarily another one of these long detailed genealogies. So the genealogies in Genesis typically mark a division between important sections, important stories. You know, after Adam and Eve, there's a long one, and then it moves on, and after Noah, there's a long one. And so here we have kind of ends the storyline of Jacob, at least as a dominant character. He'll obviously continue to be in the story, and really kind of marks the beginning of the story dominated by Joseph. So that's sort of what this is a bit of transition. It's similar to, for example, back in chapter 25, there's a similar genealogy of Ishmael, and in this case, this is Esau's descendants. So this is kind of serving to verify Esau's descendants, who went on in some cases to form these different tribes and nationalities that over time the Abrahamic and Hebrew peoples are going to come encounter with. It's sort of showing that even though Esau was not the sort of chosen son through which the covenant extends, that he does fall under Abraham's blessing, that his descendants would be many nations. So this is sort of reinforcing that idea.
Are the sons and etc. mentioned in there known to be linked to any current national tribes or groups, or do we know? I mean, they're odd names that don't mean anything to me. But
Yeah. I mean, I think it, probably a lot of this was more a way of explaining, contemporary international relations at the time it was being edited, that 3,000 years ago you may have known, I see why those people are that way, and I think it probably
It's
just
not
has,
a list of what not to call your children, is it?
There's-
Don't get many Germans called that old.
yeah. No, there's quite a bit of unusual names for sure. And some of them in verse 24, it notes that, this was Anna who discovered the hot springs in the desert while he was grazing the donkeys of his father Zibeon. That probably at some time, that was him, okay, but obviously sort of lost to history on us. But yeah, it gives you kind of a bit of a glimpse into that.
One of his wives was his cousin, wasn't it? Because it says Basamart, daughter of Ishmael.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there is some intermingling.
Yeah.
Well, if you remember, Esau had married Canaanite women, right? Hittite women, Canaanite, whoever. And that brought Rebekah and Isaac great trouble. And so when he's trying to get back in favor after Jacob steals the blessing, he goes out and marries one of Ishmael's daughters. Esau does. So there's probably a lot of some family crossover in there, which maybe goes back to Mike's point earlier. But the only other thing I would note in there is in verse 12. Amalek, who later on in Exodus, am I thinking right? Amalek turns up. Amalek is an enemy, but it's interesting that it's noted there that he was born of a concubine, that he's not perhaps purebred in that sense. Yeah. So anyway, so that's Esau's family line. And then you get a bit about...
The scribe having to write all this, a complete scroll of all these names.
Yes.
What happens
yes.
if I spell one wrong? Who's going to notice? Yeah. Okay, well anyway, so that establishes Esau as the father of the Edomites and all of their subsequent subgroups. But then we get on to Joseph, chapter 37. So a couple things to think about. Well, let me start off by asking. So in rereading this account of Joseph, anything stand out to anybody?
Well, I didn't see it mention a coat of many colours at all.
Okay, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. What-
Has he got some sort of mental disorder in a way? All he's posting. Which, even though his father, it's almost like his father is protecting him.
Yeah.
Is it because Joseph just can't keep his mouth shut
Uh-huh.
about this sort of thing?
Yeah, he doesn't come across as like,
I wouldn't like him as a brother.
no, he doesn't come across very favorably.
And after the first dream, he's just learning from that. It
It goes up with the next
next one, it goes up a notch.
That's right. That's right. So, yes, yeah.
No modesty.
I was looking at verse 15, about this man who found him wandering around. Who was this man? Verse 15.
Yeah, well, yes.
What are you looking for?
No.
Looking for your brothers?
Kind of convenient. Yes, yes.
Yeah, you wonder who that
If
man
that
is.
man had told him in the wrong direction,
Yeah.
the rest of the book you tear up.
So, I think a couple things to think about, and then we'll get into the aspects of the story. So, in verse 2, it talks about Joseph 17, tending the flocks with his brothers. The direct translation of tending the flocks is a term that would suggest like apprenticeship, like he's out learning from the older brothers. And it also reveals that he's a tattletale, right?
Yeah.
He brings them a bad report about the brothers. And then we get the detail that Joseph loved him more than any of his other sons because he'd been born to him in his old age. So,
What about poor Benjamin?
yeah.
Yes.
So Benjamin,
Really old age.
yes, Benjamin would have been even older age.
Yes.
Yeah. Quite interesting, I think,
that he's the favorite son, and it doesn't mention, I mean, his mother was Rachel,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
could contribute to that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Rachel was the
Yes.
favorite wife,
Yeah, yeah.
but she doesn't show up. There's no mention of her.
Mhm.
There's no mention of Benjamin.
Rachel, probably the youngest wife, so it's fine.
But the other thing to remember is that Jacob was the product of his mother's unexplained favoritism. Because you remember back to the stories, she liked him, and Isaac liked Esau. And, you know, we can infer why that might be from different descriptions of them. But, you know, it's never really clear why is it that Rebecca was so enamored with Jacob. So maybe that's a family trait as well. So then we get on to the gift. He made an ornate robe for him. So the strict or the close literal translation would be that it was an ornamental tunic. So we were talking beforehand, the King James translation describes it as a coat of many colors. So that's where we get the color.
You'll remember from Sunday school.
Okay. Obviously, if you have an ornamental tunic, it probably is quite colorful, quite decorative. The only other biblical use of this phrase, this Hebrew phrase that's translated ornamental tunic, is in the story, here we go again, of the rape of Tamar, the daughter of David. Not the Tamar we're going to read about in a minute. But in that story, she is described as wearing an ornamental tunic because of her status as the virgin daughter of the king. Whether that is some sort of parallel description or whether it just was sort of a highly fashionable unisex kind of garment that people would have had ornamental tunics to mark.
And would he have worn it all the time? He wouldn't be wearing it while he was out with the sheep, would he?
Well,
I wouldn't put it past him.
But maybe he would, yes.
but he does, he shows up, he shows up with it. So,
In Shechem of all places.
well, yes. Yeah, so in verse 4, when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So, so then he tells the brothers about these two dreams, which seem pretty clearly to represent all of them bowing down to him, and him being something superior. So generationally now, we've got several of these where the non-oldest first son is not the chosen one, as it were. So Rebecca goes to, she has a, she doesn't have a vision, she has a, anyway,
Yeah, you like Bob.
she gets the message about that the younger son is going to rule over the older son. So I think these dreams kind of function in that same oracle. That's what I was looking for. She gets an oracle. So I'm thinking these dreams function in kind of that same way. This is the sort of divine pronouncement of the reordering of power in this family. They're different than, for example, Jacob's dreams.
Joseph's dreams, he doesn't attribute them to God, and they aren't explicitly religious. You know, when Jacob has his dream about the angels going up and down, I mean, it's very clear that that's, you know, this religious imagery of what's taking place. So even though we know that they'll be proven to be accurate forecasts of what will happen, they aren't couched as being specifically from God. The other thing, and I may have mentioned it in some of the other sessions we've had, is that there's a lot of scholars who think that the first speech of a biblical character, especially in the Old Testament, tends to reveal a lot about that person's nature and character. And so the first thing they say is especially important. So this is the first thing that Joseph comes out of the box talking about.
Because he mentions, he's talking here about growing crops in fields. His job was looking after the sheep.
Yeah,
So
Well-
one's nomadic and the other one isn't.
well, but I think this also
It's just
speaks
because
to...
they're using the sheep here as a secondary, and it's actually him.
Yeah, well, I think the agricultural theme, though, is that, you know, ultimately during the drought, that's when this is gonna come to pass, right? Is
Yeah.
when the brothers travel to Egypt because they need the grain.
Yeah, so it's a little hint of that.
I think so, yeah, yeah.
The second time, it's just him. Doesn't even bother to represent
Yeah.
himself. Well,
Yes,
keep it cool.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, very much,
Me.
yes, yeah. Okay, so, so if we go down to verse 10, he tells Jacob about his dreams. And Jacob rebukes him and says, "What is this dream you have?" Then interestingly, he says, "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" So,
Did you think that the mother and father were the sun and the moon?
Yes,
Isn't that true?
well, I don't know, but I mean, Rachel's clearly dead
yeah.
from what this tells
Yeah.
us. So, the fact that he mentions Rachel in that way is kind of curious. And yeah, and it also says, yeah, the 11 stars were bound down, so that's the 11 brothers. So it does, it's just, seems a little out of place, that that comment, at least the way that it comes across, that Rachel would still be capable of bowing down to him in the same way that Jacob would be.
Unless it's out of sync.
I mean, it could be,
Because maybe they put it together because they want to do the Joseph story all together in one place.
well, I think
This
that's,
might have happened earlier.
That's right.
before-
Yeah, but his
That's
mother
right.
died
Before
at
she
birth,
died.
so.
No, that
No,
was
no, no.
Benjamin.
Benjamin, yeah.
So Benjamin might not have been
That's
born.
true, yeah.
It's a really
Well, the
weird
only-
dream, isn't it? How do you visualise the sun bowing?
Oh, you will.
so the only argument against that would be,
The
That there's
11
11.
stars. Yeah.
so, but
Shoes and-
But we've seen other places where I think things have been conveniently cleaned up to when the different influences come in to edit or translate or render those stories. So, yeah, so that whole section feels a little off, but anyway. So the solution is, he's gonna send him out to work with his brothers near Shechem. So we know bad things generally happen near Shechem. So as mentioned earlier, he encounters this person, this man, near Shechem, where he finds out that they've moved and they're grazing their flocks elsewhere. Again, it's one of those kind of odd encounters where someone just pops up in the middle and provides this information. I really didn't find much about why it was important that they weren't at Shechem and were near Dothan. But presumably that had some kind of importance. But regardless of where they were, they see him coming and they decide they're gonna kill him. The brotherly thing to do. Because of his garment, yeah. I mean, yeah, he would have been easily identifiable if he were wearing that.
Got the coat on.
Yes, yes,
Well, you would, wouldn't you?
yeah. As well as, not only does it expose him, but it obviously represents basically why the brothers are,
Yeah, rubs it in a bit, doesn't it?
Yes,
Rubs it in.
very much, very much. So their initial plan in verse 20 is they're gonna kill him and then throw him into the cistern. So not only would that have been really, the brutality of the murder, but it would have denied him as a proper burial, which would have had spiritual implications, and would have been understood as really an atrocity by the Hebrew readers who would read this story later. So then in verses 20 and 21, Reuben tries to intervene. Don't kill him, just throw him in the well. I'm not really sure how that would be better, but anyway.
So Reuben's going to rescue him later, presumably.
Yeah,
Take
yeah.
him back to the occupation areas and take him
Yeah.
back to his father.
How deep was this well?
What form would a cistern or well actually take? Is it like an
It's a
old-fashioned
cesspit,
medieval
isn't it?
well, or just a hole in the
No,
ground?
it's
or-
cesspit.
The cesspit, could be, yeah,
Cesspit?
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, clearly, it would be something that would not be easily escapable from.
Particularly if you've just been beaten up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so they throw him in the cistern. It's empty, so then they sit down for lunch.
They take his robe, don't they?
They take his robe, yeah, and they see a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and they decide that they will, if they fake his death and sell him, then they get rid of him, but they don't have, the blood's not on their hands. So Ishmaelites, so there's a couple things with, obviously the connection with Ishmael, right? The Ishmaelites elsewhere in the Bible is used as a generic term for semi-nomadic tribes of Arabs whose homelands were east of the Jordan. But in this case, Ishmael, as far as we know, is still alive. Ishmael is their great uncle. And so these Ishmaelites would have been their second cousins who came along. And then in verse 28, it gets even more confusing because it says, when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. So who is doing what in that verse? So, as I mentioned before, Ishmaelites could be a generic term for these nomadic tribes, as could the term Midianites. And actually, they were both terms for the same groups of people, but those names were in use at different times. They were the Ishmaelites, probably more directly earlier, and then later would be known as Midianites. So, again, so there's probably two different editorial traditions working on that verse, clarifying who it is that their contemporaries would understand the relationship with. The confusion is added. Robert Alter, in his translation, says the original Hebrew, the way that it's written, reads in such a way that it would be that the Midianites pull Joseph out of the pit and sell him to the Ishmaelites. That it just says basically the Midianites, like in this verse, it would be the equivalent of, so when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers is not in the original Hebrew. It just says they pulled him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. So the inference is it was the brothers who pulled him out, that the Ishmaelites didn't come by and pull him out, and then the Ishmaelites sold him to the Midianites.
The New Bible's got something like that in the footnotes.
Okay.
It just replaces that whole phrase with the word they.
Okay, yeah. So it's it's an interesting verse that shows a couple of different things working on that. And what's also complicated is what's happened to Reuben, because Reuben says, throw him in the pit, but don't kill him. And it doesn't ever really say that he left to run down to Tesco to pick up something for lunch. It just says the brothers. And then Reuben comes back and wants to know what's going on. So, whatever Reuben's intentions were, they've not panned out the way that he had hoped for that. So what do? They take his robe and do what?
Kill
Make it look like he's dead.
Yes, fake his death using goat's blood. Quite interesting to think about the fact that Jacob put goat's blood on his garments to fool Isaac into thinking he was Esau. So, I know. It all comes together, doesn't it? And so again, then Jacob recognizes the garment and assumes that Joseph is dead. And then the Midianites sell Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar. And then the story kind of pauses. And we get chapter 38, which
A bit like the last chapter we had last week, isn't it?
yeah,
You can take it all on its own or leave it out.
it's very much a standalone story. It's quite unclear why it's placed exactly where it is, unless it is to sort of further tarnish the image of the brothers before getting deeper into the Joseph story. It's curious because the timeline in chapter 38 is likely probably talking about a span of probably 20 years between the beginning and the end. And it doesn't really have any specific tie-in to any other point in the larger narrative. Like, I mean, did this happen before they get rid of Joseph? Did it happen after? It's really not super clear. You know, it just
be sort of meanwhile back in there.
back at the ranch. Probably a sense of that. Yeah. So what's going on here? What is the precipitating action in this story? By this time, Judah, well, he's gone off and gotten married. He's had, well, 3 sons, at least. And the eldest is old enough to be married, so probably at least late teens. And he got a wife named Tamar. But he was wicked in the Lord's sight, and so the Lord put him to death.
No idea what
Just like
that.
No idea.
No.
No idea. Now, he was the firstborn, so in this story, that's never a good thing. But,
He
yeah.
wasn't the firstborn, was he? He was the secondborn.
No,
was the
No,
firstborn.
Er's the oldest, yeah.
James, verse 6.
Oh, but Ur was showing.
Yeah, to her is human, yeah. Very
Yeah.
good.
So God kills him. So then Onan is the second eldest. So Judah says to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife, fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother.
So not marry her then, just.
Well, so, yeah, so this really is kind of a description of Levirate marriage,
Right,
which
okay.
we see occasionally through the biblical story. It was
What, you call it, what, marriage?
Levirate marriage.
Levirate, okay, thanks, sorry.
It was something that was not uncommon in ancient Middle Eastern cultures. So the idea was that when a married man died without having children, the obligation was on the dead man's brother to take, to take the widow essentially as a wife and so that she could produce offspring. Now those children would not be the children of the brother-in-law, they would be the children of the dead man, legally.
Okay.
So it was a way
Was
to
that
preserve,
inheritance sort of
yes,
thing?
it was a way to preserve the family line.
Henry VIII was aware of all this, wasn't he? When he's
Yeah.
with his
Yeah, Catherine
Oh,
Havering
yeah,
was
with
his
his
brother's wife.
marriage to Anne Boleyn and whatever. We quoted Leviticus for
Don't
this.
let's go there.
No, but
Catherine
similar-
Havering
the
was-
idea was a similar sort of
Yeah,
idea, particularly if a marriage was contracted for a sort of
Yeah.
dynastical purposes. Whether this is a dynastical thing, we
Well,
don't know.
well, this would have been dynastical in the sense that it would be important because of the way that the culture and society worked, that, I mean, everything had to come through the male lineage. And so if you wanted your family line to continue, you had to at least have a son, not so much a daughter, because she would become part of the other, of
Whoever's-
someone else's family. But you would need the son so that someone could inherit from you.
It still happened in Jesus' time, didn't it?
Yes,
They tried to catch him out of the story of the woman whose
Yes.
husband had died, and then she was married to 6 more brothers.
That's right.
Oh, yeah,
That's
which
right.
one they get, yeah, which one,
Yeah.
which one's going to
Well, yeah, we usually going to be in heaven with.
be, which one's going to be the one in heaven?
That's it, that's it, yeah. So, yeah, so that's what's going on. So that in and of itself is not, would not have been scandalous at the time. But what would be scandalous was what Onan did. What verse are we in here? Verse 9. Whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to avoid providing offspring for his brother. So that's what's going on there, because it would have been, it would not have been unusual for that to happen, but I mean, he understood that if he got her pregnant, it's not his son in a legal
Yes.
sense. This explains why in the story of Jacob and Rachel and Leah, they give their, and Sarah with Abraham, give their servants to the man to produce offspring with, and it counts as their children. So, so even though Joseph and his brothers came from at least 4 different women, they're all, yeah. God doesn't like that, so he kills Onan as well. So Judah has a plan. Well, he kind of has a plan. He has a younger son who's not old enough yet to be married. So he tells Tamar, go back to your home and live there as a widow, and when Sheila is old enough, then you can get married to him and try again. Well, she is a bit of property. Yeah, yeah,
It was ever thus for the woman.
yes, yeah,
It still is.
yeah. So a couple of interesting things about that. So one is that Judah is able to basically legislate what it is she's going to do and how she's going to behave and what her future entails, because she's married into his family. And we'll see that again in a few minutes when he pronounces a death sentence on her. That he apparently has that
Why
authority.
doesn't he keep her in his household then, I wonder? He sends her home, back.
Well, so I think he thinks, and I think it says later, he thinks she's the reason both of them have died. He's hesitant to give Sheila in marriage because, it does say that, doesn't it? Or am I making
Yeah,
that up?
actually, I see,
Okay.
he may die
Yeah.
too, just like his brother.
God
Yeah.
doesn't tell him why that he's done. That
No.
he's done. He caused his death.
Well, and what's interesting is that Tamar never, she doesn't reveal what Onan did. You know, I mean, she obviously would know
Yes.
what happened. I don't know how much leverage she would have to come out and say, he wasn't playing the game. But she keeps quiet about it and goes back to her family, and time moves on. So sometime later, after a long time, Judah's wife dies. When he's recovered from his grief, he goes up to the sheep
shearing. And if you remember from our discussion about Laban, sheep shearing ended with a great party. And that's probably what he's going up for. Someone, again, a mystery informant, tells Tamar that Judah is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she, somewhat maybe spontaneously, maybe she's planned this for a while, decides that she's going to dress as a prostitute and solicit his services.
She said she covered her face. That's not what you expect. You expect it to be a married woman to cover her face.
Well, she was
Yeah.
married.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, he thought she was a prostitute because she had covered her face.
Yeah, so it must have been, I mean, that must have been
Yeah.
a symbol.
Yeah.
Now, the suggestion by her location at the city gates and by assumptions that are made later in the story is that she's like a shrine prostitute, like she's tied to, she would be someone who practiced like ritual prostitution in a fertility cult kind of thing, which, I mean, you read some about, I mean, in ancient Rome and Greece, there was some of that, and Paul talks about it in some of his letters about, I think in one of the letters he talks about sort of these cultic prostitutes and stuff. So it apparently was a common practice, enough that he would have mistaken her for that purpose when he came upon her. And so he hires her for the price of a young goat. So again, we have this recurrence of the kid, of the young goat that was slaughtered for the blood on Joseph's tunic, that was cooked for Isaac's meal when Jacob deceives him. So it's just kind of that thing that keeps turning up. And so she says, well, give me something as a pledge until you send it, because he doesn't have it on his person.
Don't walk around with the goat.
So she asks for his seal and its cord and the staff in his hand. So the seal would have been like a cylinder that would have something etched into it, that would be attached to a cord, usually worn around the neck, and it would, well, here's your written document part, it would be rolled over documents written in clay, like a signature, you know, that then would then dry and harden. So it was the ancient equivalent of leaving your driver's license and your credit card as, yes. Well, and it would have identified him.
Yeah, we use it the same way.
Yes.
In wax.
Yes. So, yeah, so it'd be the same thing if you, went somewhere and had to leave your passport as collateral for something, you know, that type of thing. So he gives that to her, and she gets pregnant. He tries to fulfill the deal by sending the goat, sending his friend back with the goat to pay up his friend to get his stuff back. Friend can't find her anywhere, and Judah just kind of says, I'll get a new seal, I'm not going to tell anybody why I don't have mine. Kind of embarrassing. So, and he feels okay because he did try to pay her, and she wasn't there. So in verse 24, he gets the report. Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. The Hebrew manuscript is a bit more explicit. It translates roughly as, she has played the whore and has been whoring around and now is pregnant. Has that, yeah.
Charming people, isn't it?
So Judah's immediate reaction, bring her out and let her be burned to death. So again, he seems to have this ownership, essentially, that he can pronounce this punishment just at will. At that time, burning someone was saved only for the most vicious criminals. So he's really ticked off about this, which is, I'm sure reputationally, for him to have control over this woman, even though he's decided he really doesn't want to marry her off to his youngest son because it's just going to kill him.
Havering his household, he sent her home.
That's right, but it's enough of a transgression that he's going to kill her.
But he's not guilty of anything.
Well, yes, yeah. So the message comes to her, and she says, "Oh yeah, the guy whose baby this is his stuff. Take it to him; he might want to know." And obviously, it reveals Judah as the culprit. So verse 26, he says, "She's more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." And he did not sleep with her again.
So that's all.
And he doesn't apparently give her to his son Shelah. So, so it ends with the birth story. Again, twins.
Boys.
Again, unclear order of birth, perhaps. Tie a scarlet thread around the hand that comes out, but that's on the second baby to be born.
And first.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
What's the point of
It must have had some significance, wasn't it?
Yes.
Whether they were firstborn or not. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so certainly, so I mean, we know legally, and
Firstborn
traditionally it would,
inherits, yeah.
the inheritance was important.
But, but it doesn't happen so often. It seems to be more the case that that's never happens in that sort of straightforward way.
Yeah, yeah, well, certainly in this family, that's not how it works.
They don't seem to have the same understanding as firstborn as we do, because they assume that the hand coming out that's it, it's born. But it isn't.
Well, so,
Didn't even know if it was a son.
Yeah.
It's a very complicated. Definitely, that's what I thought it was.
Fancy it,
Especially between.
yes. Let's see here. So Zerah is the one with the thread on his wrist, comes out second. Perez, so I think, let me double check my note in here.
Yeah, you came second.
They made the assumption that the hand that came out first was the firstborn. But it wasn't born then. Weird.
Well, but I think, I think,
Yes, that's what we just said, yeah. And that's the end of that. That's what Joseph said.
well, but it is important who the, no, I can't find the note here. Okay. Zerah, sticking his hand out first, seems to be the firstborn, but he's overtaken by Perez, who makes a breach or bursts forth, which is the direct translation of the Hebrew. Tamar seems to address the energetic newborn in a tone of wondering affection in the exclamation she pronounces as a preference, as she names him. So this is how you've broken out. So yes, it's unclear who is the firstborn, is essentially what it is.
Does it matter, because they don't appear anymore?
Well, so Perez does. Perez will become the ancestor of the kings of Judah. So likely, the way this would have been interpreted was that Zerah was counted as the firstborn, because he emerged, part of him emerged first. Zerah is later is associated with Esau. It talks about, well, so there's the scarlet, it's a loose association, but there's the scarlet thread, right?
Yep.
So Esau was always red. So Zerah is associated with Esau, who, of course, was another twin displaced from his initial position as the firstborn.
They keep going for twins a lot, do they? Is that,
I don't
is
know.
that just good luck, or is it a sign of fertility?
Or it was a good motif in this story, I don't know, but it's,
Now that we know that twins can be one egg
yeah,
split,
yeah,
or they can be two separate eggs.
Yes.
And it looks like, you know, Jacob and Esau were two separate
yes,
eggs.
yes, yes.
Otherwise they'd have been identical.
They would have
Yeah.
been identical.
Yeah, they were one different colour, and that's,
Yes.
so they,
Yeah.
My father was identical. He didn't know whether he was the first, well, I mean, he was 13 or 14, he wasn't quite sure.
Oh,
But he was, they were identical. Apart from the fact, you may have heard this before, he had a spare thumb on his right hand. And that wasn't picked up until, I don't know how long after the birth.
yeah,
But they didn't realise.
see it right away, yeah.
He couldn't hold a pencil, so he wasn't educated. Yeah. Alright, that's a bit.
That's interesting.
Well, but it, I mean, it is interesting though to look back at some of these stories with a more modern perspective on what may be happening there. So, who wants to explain what this chapter means?
I thought you were going to do it.
Yes, yeah. Yes, so, as I said,
Judah's powerful.
he has,
That much.
he has some power, yeah, yeah. It's an interesting family story, for sure,
Part of the family.
yes. But,
Apart from Joseph, there's nothing particular about any of the other brothers, is there? No. Not really.
No.
You know.
or Benjamin later on.
Well,
yeah,
We haven't got
yeah.
yeah.
don't spoil the story.
No, sorry. Yeah.
Leo becomes
It's not a whole
the
chapter
tribes,
of
don't
any.
Yes.
Yes, yeah,
The tribes of Israel.
yeah. So, anyway, it is, yeah. So that's how we'll leave it today.
I don't know if anyone like me, that's how you've got the Good News Bible with the little drawings in.
Yes, yeah.
First of all, I sort of thought, well, who did these? There's no, it doesn't say anywhere who did the sketches, but there's a whole page of Joseph's
Yes.
story set out as like a road with all these different incidents on it, and it's got the chapters and verses of it. But that's quite common in art as well. National Gallery's got a series of paintings
Yeah.
of the Joseph story, only the bit in Egypt, in Egypt.
Okay,
And it's these sort of paintings where the same characters appear more than once
Yeah,
like
yeah.
strip cartoon. So the person, you know, whoever did those little sketches in the Good News Bible was probably aware this is how it's often depicted as a
Yeah.
windy road.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we will, so this unit is done, but we will reconvene on 28 April to begin the final 4 studies of Genesis. Those sessions obviously are primarily going to be focused on the story of Joseph. Had a note this week that our friend Charmaine in Colorado is excited for the Joseph story. She watches these every week from Colorado. And so, hello. And join us at the end of April and we will explore the story of Joseph. So looking forward to that. I'll leave you with the music for today. Not surprisingly, not a lot of music written about Judah and Tamar. So I've chosen a bit of a benediction song to sort of wrap up our time together. And one of the singers with my speaker may be a little hard to make out everything, so here are some lyrics if you want them for the song. This is "May the Peace of the Lord Go With You," performed by members of the Porter's Gate.